we're here to talk about research, and specifically how we can make research successful and how we could avoid research studies, research work streams being failures. And this is a subject that's very close to my heart as a research manager at Google. But I just wanted to get a bit of a read of the room here. How many people here are researchers? So you're research practitioners. Okay, so about half the room. And other people in the room, what do you do? UX more generally. Do you actually do like research studies yourselves? Are you hands-on in terms of doing interviews and things as well? Bit of both. Yeah. Okay, cool. So hopefully then this will resonate with the people here. Like, how many of you have had a research project that you're really proud of, that's been a big success, and you kind of look back on it with pride, either in terms of the way it worked or the outcome that it achieved? Cool. Okay, how does it feel when you have that? Rewarding? Anyone else? What's the feeling you get from a good research project, something that's gone really well? Yes, exactly. And so let me ask the reverse question. Like, how many of you have had a research project which maybe hasn't gone so well? Okay, and does anyone dare tell us how that feels? Not so good. Not so good, yeah? No. Just kind of like this, really. You just don't want to talk about it, yeah? So really what we're here to do today is to think about how we have more of the first and fewer of the second in our practice. And for me personally, this is a question that has bugged me forever. I've been a researcher for 20 years. And in that time, I've literally woken up in the night and just thought about how can we do this better? How can we make research be something that contributes to successful outcomes, but also just works well as a practice, makes people feel good about doing it, makes more people want to be researchers. So it's a big question for me, and I thought with this being UX Live, there would be an opportunity to assemble a group of UX leaders and thinkers to help kind of unravel this question a little bit and help think about how we can have more success and less failure in the research that we do. So the way this is going to work, we've got some questions that I want to ask the members of the panel here. And I'm hoping that you also have questions that you would like to ask members of the panel as well. So we'll be pausing at intervals as we go through this, just to take questions from the audience. Now, in order to facilitate that, we've got a tool called Slido that you can use to ask questions. Has anyone used this tool before? Yeah, okay, a few people, that's great. So if you go to Slido and you, I think I'm saying this right, people that have used Slido, okay, and you use the hashtag Google Panel, you will be able to get your questions onto that list, and then we'll be able to see what questions are bubbling up as we go through. So we can kind of go to the question that is the most popular question. So get your questions in there, but you can also upvote other people's questions as well. So we'll see what the group wants to hear most about. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into this. So I haven't introduced myself yet, and that's really bad. So my name's James Lang, and I'm research lead for YouTube creators. So I manage a team of UX researchers who work with people who are kind of internet famous on YouTube, who make videos, and we figure out what they need, what their lives are like, through a combination of user research, ethnography, etc. So that's my world, and as I say, I've been a researcher for many years, mainly in the UK, but also in other countries as well. I'll hand over to the rest of the panel so we can hear more about what they do. So, Monal.
Hello, everyone. My name is Monal Chokshi, and I work at Lyft. How many people here have heard of Lyft? Okay, most of you. Well, if you haven't heard of Lyft, because we don't operate in the UK, we're kind of like a competitor to Uber, except we're better. Right now, we're operating just in the US and Canada. But I started the UX research team at Lyft about 4.5 years ago, and the team has now grown to over 25 people, and we're based in San Francisco.
Good morning, everyone. We have two Steves on the stage, so I'm going to be called Buzz today. That's my nickname. I'm in transition, as you might call it. I was at Skyscanner, and previously before that was Microsoft and Skype. I'm a big fan of research in all shapes and sizes. I'm not a practitioner, but I have helped build user research teams and integrate them into rather large companies.
Good morning. I'm Paige, and I am a research manager at Dropbox. I manage a group of researchers who works with our partners like Google and apps like Slack and Zoom.
And I'm the other Steve that doesn't have an interesting nickname, so has to remain Steve for the duration of this panel. So I'm co-founder of Biglight. We're an experience design agency, and I'm neither a researcher or a UXer, so a bit of a fraud, really. But I spend my life trying to help brands like Adidas, Vans, the North Face, at a global level, both set out their strategies for experience design and also evaluate and deliver new products that will meet those needs. And research is a core part of that for us.
Okay, well, why don't we start with you, Steve, in that case, seeing as you've got the mic, as it were. I want to kick off with the question that has been on my mind in all those sleepless nights. How do we know if we're succeeding? What does research success look like? What's your point of view?
Well, for us, it's quite clear in that effectively we get paid to deliver results from research. So for me, research is really only effective if we're getting something done on the back of it, and that's first of all really understanding the underlying reasons why customers choose to do something, what their journey really looks like, and then how can we deliver products, solutions, content, whatever it is that meets those needs. So for me, the output is the most important thing rather than the input in that respect.
Cool, okay. And Paige, I think that when we spoke earlier, you said that you see this from an ROI perspective.
That's right. I think research is successful when you can tie an insight to an ROI, both in what money your company makes and also what money your company saves by not shipping subpar product experiences.
And how do you define that? Come to an ROI?
Well, I think that it's a really close discussion with your business strategy holders, people that you are partnering really closely with. And I think ROI is also, it's both short-term and long-term as well. But I think that it's really important to be able to track that insight across time. So not just make it and lose it, but be able to show that, yeah, my business was actually able to move because of it.
Okay. Steve, or Buzz, I should say. How about you? So what's your perspective on what makes research successful, and how do we know if we're succeeding?
Yes, well, at the risk of us sounding all like we're in violent agreement, and you're not going to really get, we are actually in violent agreement on this term. But I think about it as very simply, what does the business want to learn? Depending on what you want to learn, you are going to be using certain methods and methodologies. What makes it successful is clearly articulating and aligning when you think those insights will pay down. So if you're doing something that's 3 years out, from a trend analysis, you're not necessarily going to see immediate action being taken on it. And you've got to be really clear on the time horizon in the business and clearly communicate that based on what they want to learn.
And this feels like it ties back to Paige's point about ROI. Do you have a way that you conceive of ROI, even if you don't use that phrase for it?
Yeah, we don't, at Skyscanner we hadn't tracked that too rigorously because it is difficult to give a specific pinpoint in time when that might pay down. You're giving yourself time horizons. So if we do this piece of research, and we did when I first joined, a very large piece of research, which was a global attitudinal study, because we wanted to find out why people travel. And that's a very high-level thing. Of course, you're not going to see immediate results based on that. So we said this is going to set the agenda for the next 3 years. And that way the business was accepting that whilst you were spending a fairly good chunk of money, only certain aspects of that research would drop out and be actionable immediately. So clearly setting that up was really important. And you're going to track that right down to very granular things like conversion rate. Why do people drop out the funnel? And all things like that. And what you're doing there is effectively balancing quant and qual. And we'll come back to that point later. But I think that is a very key point, given that I'm sure you all work with very large data sets as well. So you've got to give the mental model why it's happening to what is happening.
Okay, so it sounds like some of it is expectation setting as well.
Absolutely.
Then. That on this time horizon, you won't see X, but if you wait for the 2 or 3 year mark, you might see something else. Yeah. Cool. Monal, how about you?
Yeah, absolutely agree with the three of you. And I think another way that we can really tell if our research is being successful is if it's being used. So we can often hear this kind of people using the language that you have used in your research, like coming up with, discussing the findings from your reports and your studies, just really hearing that in the everyday talk. So, maybe they're remembering something that one of your users said if you showed them a video clip. Hey, that's memorable. That got into their heads. That's going to start shaping the way they think and designing products and thinking about our audience more. So, I think also like elements like quotes or frameworks that you put into your research reports, once you start seeing people reusing those, putting those things into their presentations as well, I think that really shows some success that, hey, what you're coming up with and the insights that you've had are being reused.
Okay, so it's about changing the organization as well then in some way.
Absolutely, yeah, their mindset.
Great, thank you. Well, as you say, I think we are to some extent in violent agreement on this, but the ways in which research success manifests, I think we can be more sensitive to how we track that and how we set expectations, within the organisation. And I think putting it in an organisational context is really key. Absolutely. Let me now go to research failure. So this is the feeling we all agreed we didn't want, right? We don't want to have projects that don't work, that go wrong for us. Let's reflect on why this happens, though. Why do we end up with UXR projects that do fail? Monal, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I mean, at times I think we have to look again to the larger organization and really think about, what are the expectations coming down from leadership, and is there buy-in for research to begin with? So really trying to ensure that, the person who hired you or the person who your team reports up through, and those members of the executive team, really can provide the resources and the buy-in to doing the kind of work that provides the insights for our teams.
Question that's on my mind, how can you really tell if you've got proper buy-in? So not superficial buy-in, but like real proper buy-in from your stakeholders?
Headcount, resources, money, funding. Yeah, and I think also, once you are starting to present across the company, you're invited to be in some of these larger, more strategic meetings, things like that. But yeah, I mean, when people start putting money where their mouth is, definitely.
And so scenario, if you're in a position where you've got superficial buy-in from your stakeholders, but you're not seeing any of the things that you mentioned just now, what do you do?
I think then is, you start using your research skills to do research within your organization. Really understand, how can we or how might we design our team so that we are more effective, and really understand why was I hired? What are they looking for? And what do I need to do in order to get the buy-in?
Paige, I think you had a point that followed on from that as well.
I think it begins with advocates as well. And advocates are something that you can build from the ground up. So you might come into an organization and you're not immediately going to get buy-in from the C-suite. But you can start building advocates around you. You're the designer that you work with, the PM that you work with. And those advocates can build more advocates. And that's how you end up with this culture of people who not only understand and value research, but also eventually are going to give you the budget and the space and the resources to do the work that needs to get done.
I'll give a quick example, one from the bottom up that happened at Skyscanner, which was around accessibility. And I'm sure you've all had to deal with this, right? because it often gets put as an afterthought, particularly if you have a robust product that's working out there for a lot of people already. How do you then start to make sure that you've got an inclusive design roadmap? And accessibility, you've got essentially a few people in the business who cared really passionately about this and started forming internal meetups. Fast track, it's a long story, but short story. By the time I left a few months ago, there were over 200 people in that guild, as we called it. Basically, the executive couldn't ignore it. So you can do this groundswell, and now that has formed a really critical part of the roadmap going forward. So often I find research actually happens from the bottom up, with those that are really passionate about it and can tell those stories.
One of another kind of layer on that for us is because we're a third-party organisation providing research within a mix of things. So we have to get those people involved. They have to be involved. Otherwise, there is a sense that this third party has defined these things that we can't relate to. We had an example recently where we were halfway through. Basically, it's a piece of research looking at a new set of ideas for something. And the sponsor could only fly in after 2 days. And he flew in after 2 days and said, well, I don't think... Basically, the results we had by that point didn't fit his idea of what the outcome should be. Therefore, he questioned the way we were doing it in the first place. But it took him a couple of hours to realise that actually our results were based on evidence, and his were based on prejudice. So we have to get people in the room, basically.
Actually, Steve, while you've got the mic, I mean, what's your definition of research failure? Why does it happen?
This is a slightly controversial point, I know, but for me, I really don't like it when we get to the end of something and the principal outcome of the research is we need more research. That, for me, is badly designed. We haven't thought broadly enough. We haven't thought deep enough. I think we have to figure out a way, before we even start doing any research, to design in what would... So imagine you get a concept to look at, and you're looking at doing some customer interviews. You've got to plan for the fact that all of the ideas are rubbish. So, either all the ideas are going to be rubbish, or they're all going to be great, or some of them are going to be rubbish, and some of them are going to be great. So we have to... I always want to plan for the eventuality that all of them are rubbish. So we have to think broader in the way that we design the research, because otherwise we don't get any more projects. It's as simple as that. For me, if the only outcome is more research, that's failure. An outcome that answers questions and has some follow-on research questions, that's fine, as long as we answer the main question.
Yeah, so this is where we're going to disagree a little bit. I think your last point about maybe if there's follow-on research, then that's okay. But I do think that there are definitely times when, research will say, oh, actually, we need more research. And, I absolutely believe that it's important to start with hypotheses and understand, what are your objectives, and aim to design a study that will answer those research questions and those objectives and have that hypothesis testing model in mind. However, when you do a more foundational or exploratory study, you might learn certain things that require a deeper dive to really understand the opportunities that are available to, designing the product or creating new features and things like this. So, Steve, that's where I do think there are absolutely times when doing research will result in needing more research.
Is there, sorry, I can ask a question. So the distinction effectively is really pure and applied in a way, isn't it? There's the kind of the pure research to understand the customer. There's the applied research to say, is the solution that we've got, does that resonate with the customer?
Sure.
We'll take an audience question in a minute. So if you haven't done so already and there's something you want to ask, do go to the, that slide has changed. What's the URL again? It's
Slido.
Slido.
SLI.do.
Thank you.
Hands up, who's on it? Good.
Cool.
Good.
So so get your questions onto there. The thing that I wanted to just ask the group before we get there, though, is to give everyone here a super practical tip about how we can get more success and less failure. I think we're broadly aligned on kind of what both those things look like, but obviously the devil is in the detail of how you get one and not the other. So let's have a tip. Buzz, do you want to give us a tip from your world on how you can avoid avoid failure and get success? Don't do it that way. That is the wrong way to do it. And I'll just grab some water for everyone.
Well, this is not necessarily something that I devised, but I found it very, very helpful. You'll see as I go through it, it goes from very high level right down to really quite granular. And it's basically the simple strategy Mad Lib. Who's used Mad Libs before? Where you kind of got blanks in a sentence. And it goes like this. We want to learn about because something. That's the very high level, right? The problem trend we observed is something, something. I can share this afterwards. We will solve this by this and this. To make this happen, we will do X and Y. And then we know we are successful when. Okay, so you've got all those things. Now, taking people through that was quite painful at first, but once you get people's heads in that, you've got to track it all around. Now, I think it speaks to quite a lot where I've seen it happen where, we want to learn about X and Y, and that's where it stops. It has to track through, and you've got to do that with a multidisciplined team. I think that's the other point to make. So that's a very practical thing where we combined user research, the qualitative side. Most people have an argument against that, and you can talk more eloquently about that, Paige, I'm sure. But it's very important in the context of Skyscanner, where you have very low margins. It's all about the economic model, high optimization. You've got to bring in the quant. So balancing those two aspects is really important. So just to recap, Strategy Mad Lib really helped. It's one of many tools. Multidisciplined team right from the start, tracking through, and quant and qual. So those are my high-level things because I'm not a practitioner, and I see that work way more successfully and get buy-in through an organization when you take them on that journey.
Yeah, it's good advice. Who else wants to give us a practical tip?
Well, I agree with the multidisciplinary teams. I think that's critical, and we do that a lot. The other aspect is time, really. And we've dispensed with the idea that you will get everyone in the room complete, get stickies all over the room, and then when everyone's gone, you'll then start to gather the insights, and then you'll have a couple of days looking to see, gather the observations rather, then see what insights emerge. And that's fine, and that's the way we used to do things, but actually it's nowhere near as effective as kind of in-room conclusions, and then because if you have people, some of the activities that we do last 4 or 5 days, and you've got these people often who've flown in from all sorts of places, and adding a final day on where we just wrap it all up, and we actually there and then conclude what we've learnt, and we conclude what we do next, whether that's quantitative validation or whatever it is, and then write all of that down in the moment is magic, because the people haven't cleared off. When you go and a week later and try and remember what it was, it's never as clear as it is that moment when you're exhausted. You've had a whole week of it, but it's magic. It's powerful, and that's the big step forward that we've made, really.
Okay, so it's about creating those moments and capturing the key points in the moment. I'd love to hear from one of our research practitioners as well. Do you have a tip for the audience?
Well, I think if my recommendations aren't implemented, then I failed. And one way that they can be implemented is through socialization. So you'll have to come to my talk this afternoon. I'm going to go much more into it, but it's about helping people understand and believe and be able to advocate for the work that you've done. And a lot of that comes through how you share those insights, and it not being just an afterthought of, I'm going to spend all my time in the discovery phase synthesizing my work and writing a really beautiful report, and then I don't give any thought to how I tell that story.
Yeah, so I'd like to share something that we did at Lyft, which is something perhaps you can bring back to your teams as well. We really wanted to up-level the quality of our research decks. So generally, like kind of the mainstream share out is a Google Slides deck. And what we started to realize is that a lot of the decks were starting to diverge from like the normal template. Everyone was kind of doing it their own way. And so what we ended up doing is coming together as a team and saying, okay, let's try to standardize this deck so that it is useful and most efficient, and that will allow us to sort of have like a good, solid template to work from, but also make it in the best way possible. So we have slides that are kind of pre-designed that you can just like throw quotes or pictures into, and so that it's in the right order as well. So, but we're like, how do we do that? Let's do some research. So each person kind of went and talked to their main stakeholders, like 2 or 3 of them, did an interview with them, and really tried to understand like what's working today, what's not working so well, what are some examples of reports that you found to be really effective, things like that. And then we all came back together to do a synthesis, and what we came up with are a list of principles, as well as some practical tips in order to understand how we can design a template. So for example, one of the tips is, hey, people want us to get to the point. A lot of times, you know, we're leading up this like long story about, hey, then we talked to these people, and we found this, and they said that, but you know, our audience is like, okay, what's the answer? You know, what are you recommending? What do we need to do? Let's get to the point here. So one of the principles in our deck template is let's get to the recommendations right away. So within the first few slides, let's have a slide that is like, hey, what is the main takeaway? What is the thing that we want to be most memorable? So if there's one thing that, you know, the stakeholders are going to read and remember, or you know that we're identifying that for them right from the beginning.
That's great advice, and it's certainly one of the biggest bits of feedback that that I hear about research reports is that they don't get to the point quickly enough. Let's pause here for a moment and go to a question from the audience. So, do we have some questions here? And if anyone's feeling brave, I'll ask you to read out your question as well. So. So there's one right at the top of the list here from Rose. Rose, do you want to read out your question?
Thank you. So how to communicate research findings in an organization with a lot of departmental silos?
That is such a good question. Thank you. So how to communicate research findings in organizations with a lot of departmental silos? What do you do? Who wants to take this one?
This is probably this is the thing that we have to overcome. Otherwise, we don't move forward really, because we can't advocate research findings in someone else's organisation. So as a result, the only way that the most effective way we've found to do it, which builds on the points we made earlier, is this kind of involvement of broad teams, the advocate, often the senior stakeholder, being involved in the process, and the results of the findings are actually the recommendations and next steps backed up by the insights. So our job is to get to the point that by the time everyone's left, let's say that 5-day thing that I talked about, everyone has bought into all of those things, and the report that we deliver doesn't do anything other than just in a beautiful way that is useful in their organisation, because we've learned how to do that, helps them communicate what that is. So that's our job, is to provide those assets built on that process.
So you really will have to come to my talk this afternoon, but one of the tools that I talk about is called exhibit pop-ups. Dropbox is a really big company, and we have a lot of cross-collaborative teams. And we have teams that need to know about our insights because they affect their work, but they're not necessarily our immediate stakeholders. So one thing that we've done is hold our findings in an open space, like an exhibit, like a museum installation, where we invite the entire office in to walk through those those findings. And we do it in really fun and interesting ways, so it doesn't feel like a formal presentation. We've done everything from a happy hour to something that feels more like a fair. And by doing this, we're opening it up to teams that we don't normally interact with, teams that maybe don't normally interact one-on-one with research, but they need to know about the work we've done. And we're doing it in that shared space, so people from all across the company are coming in and looking at them and taking away those insights. And so that's something we found is pretty effective.
That sounds really powerful. Does anyone else want to speak to this one?
Okay. I really love that idea, Paige. And I think one of the things that we can do to ensure that like all the voices are heard in a way is when you start out your research project, you have the question, you have the objectives, is to really start also identifying what other research has been done, whether it be from, you know, a market research department or a voice of customer department, customer support tickets, you know, maybe a competitive team, intelligence team, data science, and identify, hopefully, if you're embedded within a team, like a product team, you know who those people are already to reach out to, but ensure that you are getting their perspective, any work they've done, and talk to them. And, you know, as you're doing the project, you know, including them along the way, and maybe even in your analysis. So then when you do a readout or a presentation, you know, you are able to triangulate that data and then also invite them to the presentation so that, you know, it's like, hey, you know, we're bringing forth a single voice of truth and making sure that everyone is aware of, you know, what your findings are and work isn't being duplicated as well.
Thank you. I was going to say, can we jump on to the next question? Because I've now seen the list of audience questions, and there are some really good ones on there.
Was it helpful? Was that helpful? Okay.
Yeah, and thanks for the really good question as well. Just a reminder that if you go on to the Slido, even if you don't have your own question, you can upvote other people's as well, so we can make sure we get those that are most relevant to everyone. I'm gonna jump in with one of my own now, but maybe we'll go to that list again after this. So let's zoom out a little bit from what we were talking about previously in terms of practical tips. I now want to think about those more kind of systemic success factors that make user research effective. So my question to you really would be, what factors need to be in place to make UX research effective? You know, what can we do at the level of the organization to design that in? So Paige, do you have some thoughts on this one?
Well, you have to have visibility. I mean, people have to have visibility into your work, and they need a place to look at your work. So you were talking about knowing what prior research has been done. We needed a repository at Dropbox, somewhere that people could come and find past research, not just from design research, but also from our customer experience team. So we use a tool currently called Sharper. There are lots of different tools out there, but that helps promote visibility, because without visibility, you're not going to get your work seen.
No, it's very true. And I mean, so visibility is certainly a factor. Any other factors from people, you know, that are important here?
Yeah, I'd say that one of the biggest things that we found was working very closely with commercial teams, sales teams, and customer support. I think I said previously that, you know, they're the ones who are actually talking to the customers every day, and you get really rich problem areas arising from those. I'll give one example. The customer support team were getting a lot of questions at Skyscanner, where's my booking? They thought that they were booking on Skyscanner, but they weren't. But the mental model that they had was that was where it was. Now, you could look at that as a problem, or you could look at that as a real rich insight to fix. And I think that's the framing that you got to do, right? And you probably do this all the time. The story that you then tell around that is really, really critical, making that visible and so on. I think one of the things that we struggle is, over time, research is a very large repository. And you have that institutional knowledge of researchers who've been there many, many years. You can go back through the archives, but no one else can do that. So having that really well structured is very, very important for success. Because just to build off that point earlier about silos, you often find that the silos are asking the same questions, and you end up repeating things. And you've got to know what questions each silo is asking. So we put in a principle of operation, which is you've got to concentrate on the seams. When a business is generally matrixed up, okay, so you have one part being controlled by one vertical and another part by another vertical, and yet the experience that someone has cuts through those, and yet these two don't talk to each other. Part of the research is making sure that they talk, and therefore the seam becomes one of the most important pieces to concentrate on in the user experience, because you're handing off from one vertical to another, right? Drop-off might happen, or whatever might happen. So you've got to really look at those two departments and how to string it all together with one continuous narrative. So basically what you're looking at is research operates at high level, kind of strategic arc, and then you're looking into how do you break that down to the more technical things that you can execute on across those verticals. So I don't want to take up too much time, but yeah.
I just wanted to add on to that because it's a great point. At Lyft, we've designed the UX research team so that it's embedded within, each of the researchers are embedded within various cross-functional product teams and project teams. And that's been really useful just because, you know, there's a couple of different models. Like if you think about like a hub and spoke model, the hub might be like a product manager, and all the spokes might be like a designer, a researcher, data science engineer. And in that model, each of the spokes kind of function as a service to the product manager. So the product manager might say, okay, UX research, you know, I need you to answer these questions. Okay, now I'm gonna go to the designer, do that. You know, science, I need you to answer these questions. And unfortunately, in that kind of model, you're not getting folks to be able to work together. In more of a kind of web collaboration model, a product manager might be able to say to the whole team, like, hey, this is a question we need to answer. And so maybe a data scientist and a market researcher and a UX researcher can work together and kind of, you know, kill those silos off and be able to say, okay, I'm gonna look at some of the behavioral metrics. The UX researcher will be like, okay, I'll go find out more of the qualitative answers to why that's happening.
I feel like there's, as you've been talking about this, there are a couple of common threads. So one is about the silos and the organization structure within which UX research is situated, but there's also this point about other research providers or other streams of insight that exist in the organization. I'm just interested in the audience. Do any of you work alongside other types of researcher? Do you have marketing researchers or data scientists or, you know, other people that provide insight on some level? Okay, are they in the same team as you? Or no, okay. Okay, so how about, sort of? Okay. How does this work in your organization? So, I mean, how do you rub along with other kinds of researcher?
I'll take a quick stab and then. So who's heard of the popular Spotify model of tribes and squads? Yeah? Okay. Well, a squad is a small team, no bigger than 12, multidiscipline. Whatever the goal is set for that team, you assemble the right skill sets. And that can have data science, that can have customer support, that can have all sorts. So it's really important that you get the right team together. We found that being the most kind of beneficial. So at that level, what you then got is all those small teams are then in tribes. And the tribe has a big, hairy, audacious goal, a BHAG, right? What you're looking at is, are all of those people in there aligned? And research often sits across multiple squads in order to break those silos, so you don't end up with duplication of effort. You end up with consistent story, nomenclature, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd say at that kind of level, that's where I kind of oversee things. But and then in kind of the more granular level, it's up to the researchers who are the experts to choose the right methods to extract that.
Very practically, I have a bi-monthly meeting with my CX and market research counterparts, so that we stay very aligned and we know what we're doing. And we have projects where we work together on those projects and share insights. I invite them in to share insights to my team, to my PMs, to my designers. So, yeah.
So I'm going to go to the audience question that's at the top here, which is anonymous, so I'll read it out. So, panel, What can teams do to move away from research reports as a point of insight recommendation delivery? I personally believe reports are where things go to die. What are your thoughts on this one?
So we don't do them at all. We do recommendations and next steps effectively that are based on the insights, based on the research. So it's your point really. Other people aren't really that interested in the research and the research methodology. They want to know it's robust, but they're not actually that interested. What they're interested in is what we've learned and what we're going to do about it. So I agree. The research reports they don't get read. It's important to capture all of the details and all the data, but that's really for us to build on if we go back round it again, rather than to communicate it as a way of delivering value.
Did you decide to do that because you agree with the spirit of the question, that reports are...
No, we learnt it.
Okay.
We learnt it, and effectively, a lot of the brands... some of the brands we work with really believe in the value of customer research or user research, and they're the ones... And as a consequence, not only do they believe in the value of it, they also have internal teams. And for us, they're effectively our competition. So we've just got to do something better, always. So we have to be bigger, we have to think bigger, we have to think deeper, we have to think broader. And then we've got there are other brands where they don't really see the value of it. You know, they're actually building things without validating them, without taking user needs into consideration. And our job there is to demonstrate the value of it, and therefore that a product that's delivered based on real customer needs or user needs is more valuable than one that isn't. So in both of those cases, the communication is different, but we can't just provide a report of the research that we've done.
Okay. So Paige or Monal, from a research provider point of view, how do you feel about reports?
I'll go ahead. I don't believe that, what was it? The reports are where research goes to die.
Something like that.
So at least coming from Lyft, which has been a hyper-growth company, it started 4.5 years ago. We were just a few hundred people. Now we're about 5,500 people overall. And so every week there are people joining the company and eager to learn like everything that they possibly can. The way they are able to do that, is through our research repository, which is basically just based off of Google Drive because we're a Google Suite, Google Docs company. So it is being used and referenced constantly, and they want to understand, like, what have we tried? Where have we made mistakes? And there are lots of studies that are, have a long shelf life. So I think it's really important for us to have these documented. Of course, when there's like very tactical, quick user research, things that are very tactical, maybe it's not that important and to have a report. But I always like folks to at least document a little something, just so we have a record of like, hey, we did this, we tried this, and we have a sense of like, what did the app or product look like at that time? So, whenever somebody joins into a new area, they can like kind of get up to speed quickly.
Thank you. To put the same question back to the audience, how many people here create reports for their research studies? Okay, some do and some don't. Does anyone who doesn't create research reports want to say kind of, why they choose not to? Is there a reason? Yeah.
I have one comment. Depends on the stakeholder. We might create a report or we might create a recommendation, and depends on who wants something. And then based on that, we decide if it's just the recommendation or we have to create a nice gold plate report or not.
Okay, so it depends on the audience and kind of what it's for. Okay, so that's a kind of sometimes yes, sometimes no. And anyone want to speak up for reports? Anyone feel that actually reports do have a place?
Yes, I think again depends. Where I work, I'm kind of in-house and out-house, yes. So it depends again who you're dealing with. And so one of our clients is like Salisbury Cathedral, for instance, and I'd installed Hotjar on her site a couple of months ago, and just giving her that insight and having a call with her the other day and taking through some of the but she just wanted to see it, so you had to get straight to that. But some people are quite within the company, they want to look at the more kind of data statistical stuff first before you go into that. So it's kind of fitness for purpose, but I think of course it's valuable, but like you've got to shape it depending on who your audience is.
Right, okay.
When you see the proof in the pudding with the user session recordings, you just can't argue with that really. It's really, really good.
So we've got this, quite nuanced view, I think, of where reports fit into the world here. I wondered, I don't know who raised the question, but I wonder whether we're using reports in a relatively specific sense in the question or not. Whether it's perhaps not including some of these other variants that we've been talking about just now. Any other final thoughts on this before we move on?
Just quickly on that, I think you have to be very careful on how people learn, right? How people take in information. Some people are going to feel very strongly on the more emotional side of things, in which case you've got a narrative form in the report. Other people are going to look at it purely from a results, recommendation, numerical point of view. And you've got to balance the two, but make it super pithy. I mean, to your point earlier, you've got to get to the point. The appendix is where all the methods, and I think if you want to wallow in all of that, sure. But make it super precise. Yeah.
Right, let's have another audience question here. Monal, I'm going to put you on the spot, I'm afraid. So another question that's come through is, do you have some examples of how you have proved that you saved the business money in the past? And actually, this is to everyone as well, but maybe would you mind kicking us off?
Sure. I'm trying to think of a specific example. And it is true. One of the things that I asked the team to do is first to understand the impact that the research is having, is track decisions that the team, the product manager, the cross-functional team, the designer, has made as a result of the research. And then try and understand, once it's implemented, first you gotta get credit for the decision, because sometimes it's not always implemented in the product. But once it's implemented is then to track the business metrics that move. And it might not be 100% because of the research, but at least you have the understanding that, hey, I help move this metric. So in that case, we've done research where we've understood what the metrics were prior and like how much money, for example, was being generated or new users we were getting, and then looked at the change that happened in the UI or product as a result of research, and then finally looked at, well, what changed in the business metrics? And of course, there can be lots of variables there, but that's typically like the formula for us to really understanding how to measure, if we save money or not. So we can't take all the credit, but I think it's definitely a great data point to have in terms of, showing how research is valuable, the ROI.
Kind of saving money, but not really, sort of thing, is just making sure that before we start anything, there's almost always loads of research that's been done before. There's all, and some of it might be quite old. In some cases, like why do people go on to travel or things like that? These are timeless things that don't change because they're based on basic human truths. So often, just looking back at that body of research with a different lens can bring out a lot of insights, so that it's not necessarily saving money, so that the money that is invested in building on that. And I think that's a really important way to start anything.
I'll give one quick example, and this is probably one of those ones where the business views a certain area as a cost center, not a profit center, and that's customer support. And you've got to flip that round, right? Because when you're looking at the metrics based on one mindset or the other, if it's a cost center, what's the bottom line they're going to do? They're going to try and reduce the amount of calls that come in, how long they spend on the call, et cetera, et cetera. They're effectively counterintuitive metrics, because you'll see the relationship with the customer go down. Whereas if you turn it into a profit center, looking at the customer lifetime value, then you end up with a different set of metrics that proves far more positive from an ROI perspective. Does that make sense? So you've got to think at all kind of levels and try and see around the corners of what the effect is based on what you measure, because what gets measured gets done.
Absolutely, and that sounds very similar to the concept of failure demand, that you need to track through the impact of the changes you're making to the ultimate downstream point where they're still affecting the business. So yeah, Paige. Oh yes, please.
Yeah, exactly about that. If your changes and your research is that small part of the product that will be released in 6 months, so how you can relate to those business factors, how you can measure that, because there is a lot of things coming to that product from different sides, and you affect that little. How you can measure saying that, oh, we sold more products because of that?
It's a great question. Does anyone feel brave enough to take that one on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely difficult, but it's a team effort, and there are lots of variables. I think Buzz brought up a really great point about customer support. I think that is like, hey, if we do research, let's say, on a help center, and we're able to redesign like the navigation and get people answers faster, like through self-service versus time spent like on customer support calls, that's a really specific and really direct correlation versus like, say, the best opportunities to show that like that you moved a metric is when it's a very specific thing, and like obviously nothing else has changed except the thing that you helped make the decision on due to your research. So I mean, 6 months later, yes, I mean that's I think the hard part is having to wait until it's implemented and you can measure metrics again. So depending on how fast your company moves, you might have to wait a while.
So just one thing to add to that. I was given some advice once about the order in which one might tackle research studies or UX challenges. And the advice was to always start with a conversion funnel project, because it's the easiest way to show the impact of good UX work. And if you've won the trust by doing so, you can then go on to things which are a little bit harder to measure or a bit less tangible. But it's hard to argue with the conversion rate if you can make that change.
I'll go a little bit on that one. It's a good place to start if you have a fundamental sense that the conversion is really, really poor. But when you have a business that has spent probably years optimizing, you're probably going to waste your time because it's been optimized to within an inch of its life. And therefore, you've got to look around the periphery, not just around one singular metric. You've got to look at the whole gamut of what someone is actually doing along that funnel. And by way of championing my talk tomorrow, I'll give a very real example of that, where you can optimize call to action buttons, for example, and often it's a waste of time. Just as a heads up.
Check out that talk. So just before we have to wrap up, I'm conscious that as we've gone through this, we've talked a bit about the way that we can transmit insight, and whether reports are the right way to do that, whether repositories are useful as a way to do that, the role that the organization structure plays in doing that. There's a word that I'm surprised we haven't heard, which is storytelling. And I just wondered if anyone wanted to kind of, speak a bit about how storytelling plays a part in the work that their team does.
I think it always starts with a story, actually. Whether you call it narrative, story, or whatever, they're all effectively the same thing. I would say very practically, we did it with cartoons. Super simple cartoons, and just make sure you get to the payoff in about 6 or 7 frames. Really, really simple, digestible. If you're going more broader and you're talking to a very larger audience, then it becomes videos and photography and so on, because it's often a lot of contextual things that start to happen then. Yeah.
I started my career as a journalist. I did not go to school for research. And one thing I found as a foundational skill that I've taken alongside my career is that the importance of understanding what the story is and understanding the audience that you're telling that story to and being able to bring that story out. Because that's when you find the research that's been done 2 years ago, people still talking about it, and it really reverberating with people. You have to be able to tell the story of your work. If it's an afterthought in your process, then it's going to block you from being able to actually do effective research.
Should I tell my... so I have an anecdote. And it comes from a good place. So some of the researchers on my team had done some really great research. In fact, they had changed our CEO and COO's mind about a decision they were going to make. So we were like, this is amazing. And this was, a really important aspect of, a win for research. So we're like, okay, let's present this at, a large company meeting. And I take fault for this. This is like a cautionary tale. So, I said, hey, we really want to draw on storytelling and bringing forth user empathy, to really help our audience understand our users. In this case, it was a story about our drivers. And oftentimes we don't know our drivers that well. They might come from a different socioeconomic class and have a very different lifestyle. So let's really draw on that empathy. Well, the great thing is they did a great job of getting folks in the company to align with the empathy, and be empathetic towards drivers. But so much so that what happened was, we told the story from the user's point of view, and then the result that we came up with was so as a result, the research suggested this. And there were some folks in the audience that said, oh, well, that's obvious. But actually, this was hindsight bias, because if we had, they thought this was like a normal decision. We didn't throw our CEO and COO under the bus. We didn't say, well, actually, they were going to do a different thing. But what was missing was the business side of the story. So, folks thought, oh, well, isn't this the obvious answer? But that's because we primed them with the whole empathy story. If we had told them ahead of time, like, hey, this was the business issue that we were facing, and then we learned about the empathetic part that we didn't know before, and then gave them so we changed their minds. That would have been a much better story to tell. But yeah, it's a cautionary tale of like actually doing too good of a job of getting folks into the empathy and relating to the user too much without telling the business side and gaining that credibility.
Yeah, those feel very important aspects of the work we do, and getting the balance right feels really important. Have any of you experienced similar challenges in balancing out the empathy and the kind of the nuts and bolts business side, or do you see them as not antithetical?
No, I think for me, saying the same thing over and over again, that the purpose is solving the problem, and I'm a big fan of really getting onto the grips of why people do things, and that brings out the empathy thing, and constantly we've got to demonstrate that we've reached beyond the practical to what's meaningful for people and the kind of core human purpose that we're at. So I think implicit in just delivering a good result is bringing all of that out as well at the same time.
Let's jump to the audience questions again. So do we have Gordon here? Yeah, hey Gordon. I was just looking at your question. Do you want to... Yeah, don't worry, I'll pass the mic to you.
Yes, so how do you avoid biased results with internal research teams?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. So how do you, so the question from Gordon was, how do you avoid biased results from internal research teams? So if I can interpret, you've got a team within an organization, like how do you avoid the results being biased by the politics of the organization? Is that?
Yeah, I suppose a bit of a caveat, I do work for a UX research consultancy. So
Right, okay. So you're thinking more of kind of in-house teams?
Well, we work with in-house teams.
Yeah.
And obviously we provide research for those teams. And one of the things that some of our clients say is why they use us is they don't want to be marking their own homework.
Yes, okay.
So that's the first thing you should do, is hire a third party to to help you do it. And I completely agree with that.
I'd say this. I've found that by asking the right question, you will often eliminate some of the biases. For example, I'd say if you're asking why someone does something, you've already started off on the wrong question. Because why they will interpret what you think that you're trying to get out of the question, and therefore you build in their biases. Oh, someone disagreeing, that's all right. Whereas if you start framing it with what are you trying to achieve, you start to get under the skin a little bit more. Now, I know that that's just a simple method practice, but often those that want to do research, other disciplines that aren't trained in it, will build in their own biases into the questions. Okay? So how you ask questions of people is super important, and you've got to check that off.
I felt like the question, it has a challenge to those of us, myself, Monal and Paige, who work in-house. Like, how do we avoid, there being bias in our practice? I think it's a really, really fair question. What do you make of it?
Well, I think it's important to look internally and understand what assumptions that you've made that over time have begun to feel like fact, and be able to call out those assumptions. And I find it's not just the researchers, but it's also the PMs and the designers, especially those who have been at a company for a long time, who have these really strongly held assumptions. Something that happened relatively recently was that we had stakeholders come together, and before we even kicked off a project, we discovered that they had outcomes that they wanted to gain from this research, and they wanted to engineer the work in such a way that the outcomes matched what they wanted. They wanted the users to say XYZ because that aligned with their business goals. And it's really important that we work to call that out at the beginning and say, you know what, we actually need to go into research with this mindset. Because if you don't, you're going to end up coming out of a workshop or out of whatever part of the research process you've gone through with them, and come to this point, which the team came to, where they say, you know what, the outcomes that we have from the research we have done are in complete contradiction from the outcomes that you wanted to see, and it's because you went into this with your own assumptions.
Right, I agree, and I like to call out those assumptions and say, like, hey, actually, this is a hypothesis, and then this is something we can test.
It is an ever-present in our discussions at Google, though, I would say. And I think part of the job that we have as researchers and research leads is to shine a light on the difference between evidence-based opinions and hypotheses. And the more that somebody's seniority comes into play, the more it's important that we're playing that role, I would say. But it never goes away, I think it's fair to say.
I was going to say, on the... sorry, it seems like I don't want to hog the mic, but there's a lot of presupposition and solutions that are written into briefs as well, and you've got to spot those. Yeah. And there's a great example, actually, on YouTube, I think, with Johnny Ive and Blue Peter, where they gave a competition which was to design a new lunchbox. And he said, well, you've got to be very careful about the words that you choose when you're giving out a brief. So what's the solution hidden in there? A box, right? But it's not a problem statement, it's already a solution, right? So you can call those things out very quickly when you see people writing hypotheses and so on. But hypotheses are there, obviously, to design something to test against. And then you end up with a principle, which is you design like you're right, but you test and listen like you're wrong. And if you have that in the forefront of your mind, you're going to be more open to those biases built in.
Yeah, it's a nice maxim. So we're nearly out of time. I guess I had one final question for the panel here. So I'm glad from today's discussion that I don't feel like I'm on my own, that research is difficult and challenging, and at the same time can be immensely rewarding as well when we get it right. So my question to the group is kind of what keeps you going when this is difficult, and when maybe things aren't going your way and you're having the challenges of people in your team trying to tell you what the results should be. You're having to find good ways to communicate the findings that will be listened to. All these things that we've discussed today. What inspires you? What keeps you going?
Well, in 2 hours' time, I'm going to be talking about the fact that we live in an era where the number one brand differentiator is the customer experience that they provide. And I think that understanding our customers, understanding their needs, and understanding how to meet them is the critical thing that underpins that. So I think this aspect of what I do, what we do, is the most important, actually. So that's the thing that drives me. I think we're doing something really important.
There are two things that really energize me. One is the look on someone's face when they watch their first user interview, even if the feedback you're getting is really depressing. It's just like a light has gone off, and there's a little tiny piece of passion that has started in that person that you know is only going to grow. And then the second thing that energizes me is being in a meeting and having someone outside of research tell me my insight and recommendation back to me without even realizing it.
Nothing more to add. Yeah.
For me, it's my team. I just love all the folks that I work with on the UX research team. And we really have a nice feeling of community. You know, all you folks who do research are quite empathetic people, and so that really comes out in our team dynamic. So we're all there for each other, supportive, helping each other out. Even though we're all busy, we always have time for each other, and we have each other's backs. So it's just a really nice feeling to come to work and be able to interact with folks that you really respect and enjoy being around.
Absolutely. I mean, we can agree that user researchers are great people, I think,
Yes.
is the conclusion of this. So from my point of view, actually, it's to look out and see this audience. 5 years ago, I don't think you would have got a standing room only audience to talk about user research at 9:30 in the morning at a conference. And I think it's a sign of how far things have come that people are actually really engaged with this. And we have so many user researchers here in the room. So thank you to all of you for being here, and thank you to our panelists as well. Enjoy the event.